Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Science on Screen. This is the last installation that we have for 2021, but we are very excited. Our next season will begin in 2022, but I do appreciate you being here with us tonight. Science on Screen is a nationwide initiative to promote scientific literacy through entertainment, inspiring audiences, and increased appreciation for STEM topics like science, technology, engineering, and math. And we do that by pairing science topics with entertaining and fun movies like the 1954 classic we just watched, Rear Window with Jimmy Stewart. Science on Screen is an initiative of Coolidge Corner Theater with major support from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. I'm excited that following Rear Window tonight, we were able to have with us Susan Bennet. Susan is a headshot and creative portrait photographer based in St. Louis, Missouri. She specializes in working with people who really, really hate having their pictures taken, which would be me. So I will be paying very close attention tonight. Coming from a background in sociology and a long career in corporate marketing, Susan now works to deconstruct the power of our images, the power our images have over us by exposing all the ways in which the camera lies. So hold on one second and we'll get things switched over to Susan.
Misty, I'm ready to share my screen when you set it up. There we go. Share screen, PowerPoint, share, and slideshow. How are we looking? Am I up on screen? Is my PowerPoint working? Is everything working? Can you guys hear me? Is my PowerPoint up there?
Yes, Susan, you're good. You are ready to go. I'm sorry, I was distracted a second.
Okay.
Welcome, Susan Bennet.
Thank you so much. And thanks to everybody for being here. I hope you enjoyed Rear Window. I haven't seen that in quite a long time, but Alfred Hitchcock really can never disappoint. And we are going to continue that theme, and we're going to be talking about photography in my talk. And hopefully that's going to be with at least 75% less murder and dismemberment. So let me know at the end how that went. But I'm really hoping for a good, strong 75% reduction in murder during my particular photography talk. So I am going to be talking about the science of the selfie. And I'm just going to jump in here and share with you two quotes that really inform the way that I think about photography. And the first thing is something that my freshman figure studies professor said to me. I was a freshman studying photography in art school, and I was taking a figure drawing class. And this professor said, photography is great, but it is a 2D solution to a 3D problem. And that was just something that at the time kind of blew my mind. And I was like, yeah, that's profound and also true. And that stuck with me all of my life. Photography is a very powerful medium, but it is a 2D solution to the 3D problem of the world and the human figure. And then the other quote that I always like to quote is me quoting me, and that is, all photographs are lies. Absolutely, all photographs are lies. There is no such thing as a photograph that really tells the truth about what's happening in front of the camera lens. And I think that the more I talk to people about how all photographs are lies and the ways that photographs do lie, the more I can sort of break that power that photographs have over people to sometimes ruin their day or make them feel sort of badly about themselves. So let's talk a little bit about my backstory and how I got to where I am and why it is that I care about these things. By the way, over here on the right-hand side of the screen are four, I did a self-portrait project during COVID because I was the only model I had access to. Here are all lies, to some extent over here on the right-hand side of the screen. So as I said, I started studying photography when I got out of high school. I went to art school, and I was in art school for 2 years. And art school is really expensive. And photography, I thought maybe this is not going to be a career that sort of pays off for me. So I ended up changing majors, and I switched over and got my undergrad in sociology, which I also find fascinating, sort of the study of human condition and how people behave in groups and the sociological factors that influence us all. I parlayed that into a career in marketing, and most of my career was spent in marketing, both for large corporations and small nonprofits and educational institutions. And about 5 years ago, I was working in marketing management, and I realized that marketing was destroying my soul, and it did not feed me, and it did not make me happy. And I left the job that I was in, and shortly after that, I opened my photography studio. So this sort of zigzaggy pattern I've taken through life, and the different things that have influenced me, as well as my own feminism and my musings on the way that images are weaponized in our society, specifically against women, to sort of control us and control how we feel about ourselves. All of these things inform what I bring to my own photography and what I bring to this discussion that I want to have with you tonight. So why this talk, and why is this important? In 2018, I saw this article that really shocked me, and it said that 55% of plastic surgeons reported that their patients were coming to them and asking for procedures like nose jobs and chin augmentations based on the fact that they didn't like the way that they looked in selfies. And I was shocked and horrified by that, because immediately I was like, yeah, but that's not how those people look. They're trying to get a nose job for a problem that doesn't exist. And so I posted about this on social media. And I thought all of my friends would be like, oh, yeah, that's ridiculous. And my friends were like, what do you mean? Like, and one of my friends said this, you mean the camera doesn't just take a picture of what's there? And I was like, oh, gosh, no. Like, that's not how cameras work at all. In no instance does the camera just take a picture of what's there. Cameras are always distorting and changing things. And so then it became very important to me to sort of write this down and share this with my friends and with my clients. So in April of 2018, I had some models into the studio. I'm going to be showing you those pictures later. And I shot some examples of this, and I wrote a blog post about it. And it, by far and away, is the most popular thing I have ever written. 3 years later, it still gets 20,000 views per month. People are always searching, do selfies distort your face? Is the front camera what I look like? Do cameras distort your face? Are selfies accurate? People are really concerned about this, and it's constant. And I get a lot of messages from people when they read that blog post talking about how this works, and they're like, you made my day so much better. Thank you. And that's really what I want to do with this talk, is talk to you about how you can sort of release that power of seeing a bad photo of yourself and release that horrible feeling. Like, is this what I really look like? And I don't want you to have a bad day. So I'm going to talk to you about how cameras lie. And we're going to get into some really fun tech specs, and then we're going to get into some really cool examples. So I hope you find it half as interesting as I do. So what we're going to cover today, we're going to talk about how cameras work. We're going to talk about things like lens width. We're going to talk about subject camera distance, lens distortion and forced perspective. We're going to talk about in-camera processing, which is something you might not be aware your camera is doing, that your camera is making a lot of decisions for you about how your photos look without you being aware of that. I'm going to go over the difference between RAW files versus JPEG files, and we're going to talk about what dynamic range is and how that affects everything from the way the sky looks in your photos to your skin tone. We're going to talk about how all of these things affect your photos. And then at the very end, I'm going to give you some tips and tricks of some things that are within your control to get more flattering photos, because that's really what everybody wants, right? I allow for the possibility that there's somebody out there who doesn't want a more flattering photo, but I'm assuming that most of us do. What we're not going to cover today at all is retouching and digital alterations, or photo filters and smoothing. These two things are topics that could be, I could talk 2-3 hours about these things alone, and I'm not going to. It's not part of what we're talking about today. So none of the filters, none of that, just really the hard, technical, crunchy data of how cameras work and how lenses work. So if I had to sum all of this up into like a sentence, and too long didn't read for all of this, what I would tell you, the reason you don't like your selfies is that camera lens is way too wide, and that camera is way too close to you. And that's the problem, right? So we're going to go into a lot more detail about that, but that's the basic problem. So lens width and subject camera distance are two interrelated factors, and both of them are going to contribute to this effect that we're going to talk about, which is the effect that you don't like, where your face looks all distorted. All right. So cameras, I love them. I love photography. I love photographing people, but they are very flawed instruments of perception. Humans are built to interact in real life 3D spaces, right? Our eyes and our brains have evolved to work together and to interpret what we see in front of us and around us. And while we're looking at things, we are constantly making allowances for the spatial relationships between objects. things are closer to us, are farther away from us. We understand that inherently when we are in the presence of those things. Cameras can't do this. Cameras flatten everything down. Again, they're a 2D solution to a 3D problem. They flatten everything out, and that leads to an effect that is called forced perspective. And we're going to see some really fun examples of forced perspective, and I'm going to explain to you what that is and how that works in fun ways, and then how that works in not so fun ways. So forced perspective, and this is really important to remember, is this idea that anything that's closer to the camera is going to look a lot bigger than anything that is farther away from the camera. And when it's in the camera, when it's a picture, your brain will not necessarily be able to correct for it like it would in person. All right. So here's what that looks like. So I had this lovely model, Caitlin, in my studio, and I had her stand and hold her hand out to the camera. And look how big her hand looks. It looks like her hand is like half the size of her body. And then, of course, she pulls her hand back, and the hand is the same size as the face. In this particular instance of forced perspective, our brains know that hands, what size a hand is, what size a face is. And so we can pretty easily correct for this. Like your brain was like, oh, weird, but yeah, that's not reality. So we're going to go into some examples that our brain can't correct for quite that quickly. But this is that basic effect, right? If it's closer, it looks really big. If it's farther away, it looks smaller. So forced perspective is something that is used to really fun effect in films. In fact, Peter Jackson made a big chunk of Lord of the Rings using this technique. Because he had actors that needed to look different sizes, vastly different sizes, but they were pretty much same size humans, he built special rigs to use this forced perspective to make them look smaller or larger. So in this top left picture here, we see Frodo and Gandalf seemingly riding in a cart next to each other, and Frodo is really tiny and Gandalf is really big. If you look down on the bottom left-hand side of your screen, you can see that actually the actor who plays Frodo is sitting maybe 4 feet behind the actor playing Gandalf, right? But when you go back and you film it from the right angle, it just looks like Gandalf is a lot bigger. So that is what's called an in-camera special or practical effect, and no CGI involved in this, and it's just a really good way to sort of trick the eye. In this picture here on the right, it's the same thing, except our eye can tell that Frodo's not in focus, so he must be farther back, and so he's not. This is not a convincing effect here on the right. Okay. Anyway, so that's how that's used in film. Forced perspective is also used in trick photography. So pretty much as soon as photography became sort of affordable to the general person, people started doing trick photography. We've got this guy down here on the left-hand side who is looking like he's going to capture that plane, like he's about the same size. And these ladies holding, standing on their friend's hand, seemingly. I know we've all seen photos of people like sort of with the Eiffel Tower or holding up the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Those are all sorts of trick photography that use this forced perspective concept. And this one just happened. So this was too topical for me not to include. So a few weeks ago, this poor photojournalist was tasked with taking a picture of the Bidens while they were visiting the Carters. And it caused this giant uproar because everybody was like, oh my gosh, are the Carters like, actually really tiny people, or are the Bidens giants? And I could see immediately what happened, right? This photojournalist was put in a really tiny room with these people, and he had to bust out a super wide lens. And because the Bidens were closer to the camera, they look a lot bigger. And just because the Carters are a little bit back, they look really tiny. But this causes like huge, big fuss in photojournalism circles because people were like, oh my gosh. And photojournalists are not allowed to edit their photos to correct for this. So he had to just post what he had. So that was just kind of a funny practical effect that we've seen recently in the news. So that is what forced perspective is. So now I'm going to start to talk to you about camera lenses and how they start to create that forced perspective and why the lens that's in your cell phone is really, really bad about doing these things. So tech specs and camera lenses. I borrowed this graphic from Nikon.com because it is a really great example talking about different angle lens, right? So we've got a wide angle lens or a longer or telephoto lens. They all offer us a different field of view when we're looking at things, right? So a wide angle lens does what it says it's going to do, and that shows you a very wide slice of the scene in front of you. And this is perfect for capturing like a landscape or as our photojournalist friend found, a lot of information in a really small room. You need a wide lens. You can capture everything on the sides. A longer lens, sometimes we're going to call that a telephoto lens, is going to give you a narrower view of what's in front of you, and it lets you get really close to an object that's really far away, but it's going to cut off everything that's on the sides. Okay, so that's the wide angle versus a longer lens. And you can see here the examples of sort of the different, fields of view that they offer. So a professional camera that a professional photographer is going to use has interchangeable lenses of different widths. Width is also sometimes termed the focal length of the lens, okay? And those are used for various scenarios. So say I was out on location and I needed to take a picture of a landscape, I would pull out a really wide lens. And if I needed to take a portrait from far away, I would pull out a telephoto lens, and I would just change that on my camera so that I had the appropriate lens for the appropriate topic. With your cell phone camera, these are evolving all the time. And so they may have one or more lenses or cameras built in. Some of them have like up to 4 cameras built into them now. And they have varying widths or focal lengths, but most of them are going to be relatively wide angle. You're not going to get an extreme telephoto lens with the cell phone camera technology that we have right now. Okay. And so here are some examples, and I wanted to throw some numbers in here so you could start to sort of gauge in your head where the problem starts to come around, okay? A 35 millimeter lens, that's a good sort of a walking around everyday street photography focal length. So if you don't know what you're going to be shooting, a 35 millimeter is a good one to have on your camera. Like that can capture pretty much anything. A 50 millimeter lens, not a 50 millimeter lens, but 50 millimeters is when the human eye and brain are working together, they produce a perceived focal length of about 50 millimeters. That's really complicated. There's a lot of math there, and this is an average because actually the focal length at the center of our eye is different than the focal length in our peripheral vision. And I'm not going to get into all of that, but this is a good sort of average of the perceived focal length of the human eye, okay? 85 millimeters is the optimum focal length for portraiture. That's pretty much what people think is the most flattering for faces. That's hotly debated because photographers really like to argue about stuff, but 85 millimeters is accepted as a very flattering lens, right? So 35 millimeters is, for buildings and stuff. 50 millimeters is about what your eye sees. 85 millimeters is great. And then you get to your standard front-facing selfie phone camera focal length, and it's 25 millimeters. It's way, way, way wider than any of these other lenses that we're talking about. So that's a really, really wide lens in that camera, okay? Again, these are all sort of rough equivalents. So if you want to argue with me about math, skip it. I don't like to argue about math. So what you're asking yourself, though, is like, how does this all come together to make me look awful? And let's start to explain why. In portraiture, generally we want the subject to fill the frame, right? If you're taking a picture of somebody, if somebody else is taking a picture of you, they're going to take a picture of your face and maybe sort of down to your waist. They're not going to take a picture of you in the room and the dirty laundry and the cat licking itself and all that. They're going to focus on you and fill the frame. That's a good portrait. If you want to fill the frame with that wide angle lens that's in your phone, you have to get really, really close to the subject, right? So what have we already learned? A wide angle lens that's close to the subject starts to cause distortion, and it makes things look bigger than they are, and it makes things look kind of strange, right? So the closer you get to the subject with that wide angle lens, the more distortion you're going to see. By the way, the camera manufacturers, the phone manufacturers are not trying to ruin your day with this. They don't have a lot of options because the average human arm length is 25 inches. And actually my workable arm length from like nose to where I take a selfie is 20 inches. So they have to put a wide lens in there so it's functional. And it does this distortion, but they're not actually gremlins doing this to make your day worse. I don't think anything's possible. I don't know. So let's talk about what this looks like when we apply it to the human face. I've got 3 examples here with humans. I invited these models into my studio. Again, this is from that blog post 3 years ago. And we're talking about the focal length of the lens that I'm using plus the distance I was from the subject. Remember, the closer I am, the more the distortion. So on the far left, here's Caitlin, and this is about a 27 millimeter equivalent lens. I was about 16 inches away from her when I took this picture, and I took it so her head and chest fill the frame, right? It's a portrait. Compared to the one next to it, look at the size of her nose, okay? Look at the size of her jaw and the angle of the jaw. Look at how on the left-hand side, the cheeks are much wider, the eyes are much larger. And this one is a really big one. Look in all three of these, look at the size of her hair. So when you're taking a selfie, have you ever had a day where you're like, man, my hair is fantastic today. Oh my God, look at me in the mirror. This is great. I'm going to grab a selfie of this. And you take the selfie and your hair is flat and lank and looks ridiculous. And you're like, what just happened to me? Like, I don't understand. Are my eyes deceiving me? No, your hair is farther back than your face. Your hair gets smaller and the face gets bigger because of this effect. I actually had to explain this to my hairdresser, and she was so relieved because she was like, I take photos of my clients with my cell phone all the time, and their hair looks terrible in it, and I don't know what I'm doing. I'm like, oh, you got to get further away. And I gave her some tips. So that's a big one too. Okay. So I'm 27 millimeters, 16 inches from the subject. This next one, about 80 millimeters, 6 feet from the subject. And this one, I was way far across the room, 15 feet from the subject. And you start to see the difference in how the face looks, right? Completely different face shapes here. So let's look at this in a male model. This is George. Again, all the same specs for these. What I'd like you to notice in George is not just the horrible effect that it has like on his nose and forehead, but just the width of his head in general. I mean, look at the difference in the width of his head. Also, look at the slope of his shoulders in that far left photo. Versus how nice and strong his shoulders look in the two that are more on the right, okay? Again, 27 millimeters, so close up, it screws up everybody's face. Now his face is very elongated and looks slimmer. It doesn't suit him at all. And the nose is just all out of proportion, just doesn't work at all. So in this last one with Grace, this is super interesting because Grace is actually somebody who has a very small chin. So when I did this to her, she almost turned into an anime character. I mean, her chin almost disappears. Her eyes are ginormous. The forehead is really big. Again, comparing the photo on the left to the photo on the right, her hair is sort of just lank and hanging there. Now, I took these pictures like 90 seconds apart. So she didn't zhuzh up her hair. She didn't do anything differently. This is purely the effect of that lens and that up closeness, making the hair look much flatter than it is in real life. Okay. So then as we move to that 80 millimeter and then finally the 320 millimeter, you can see the effect of the compression on Grace from really far away. It starts to actually make the chin look stronger and the face look broader, which Grace can take. So a lot of these things, when I'm shooting with people in the studio, the focal length, I have my, my key ones that I always go back to, but sometimes that can really depend on the facial structure of the client, what I do with them. So hopefully this part has convinced you that like what you see in a selfie is not real. And there's really no way to control for that. It's only just that you have to accept that it's not real, that this is not what your face actually looks like. Oh, I have to throw in a disclaimer. All of these people are professional actors and models, and they did know that I was going to put these horrible, unflattering photos of them up on the internet, but I did want to share. These are really good looking folks. So I just wanted to put some pictures up here to let you know that these are, these are not people with really twisted anatomy in their faces. They're good looking people, and just to be fair to them. So at the end of the presentation, I'm going to also go over some tips and tricks to how you can minimize the distortion from a wide angle close-up and then possibly use it to your advantage, depending on what it is that you want to do with photography. And to be fair, I'm going to use selfies of me for that. So you've got that to look forward to. Okay, so let's move on to sort of the second half of this. And I hope I didn't skim over anything too quickly in there and that all sort of made sense to you. We will have time for questions after the presentation is over, if you have any. In-camera processing. I'm not sure how many of you are aware that in-camera processing is even happening. In every single digital camera, there is some processing and decision-making going on that the camera does for you without you knowing about it. So what you see is definitely not what you get, and what you get is definitely in no way what you saw, okay? And so here's an example, and I'm thinking this has probably happened to a lot of people. You go to the park and it's a gorgeous day and everything is fantastic and you're so happy and you think, oh my, I love nature. Really, everything's wonderful. Look at this brilliant blue sky. Look at this beautifully blooming purple tree. I'm going to take this gorgeous picture as a wonderful memory of my day here. And you get home and you open up your camera roll and you're like, what happened? What was I thinking about when I took this picture? Well, we've got a couple different things that we've talked about that all work together to give you this horrible monstrosity here on the right. And we're going to talk about those in a second. One of those things is knowing the difference between a RAW file and a JPEG file. I swiped this definition from Adobe just because I thought it was pretty succinct. And it is that when an image is captured in a digital camera, there's a digital sensor that captures the image, and it is recorded as raw data. And raw is what it sounds like. It captures everything, every single bit of information that's there. If the camera format, the output is set to JPEG, the raw data is processed and compressed before it is saved. If the camera format is set to RAW, no processing is applied, and therefore the file stores more tonal and color data. Okay, so you've got this big RAW file, and it's huge, and it takes up a lot of space. And you can also have a JPEG photo, and it takes up a lot less space, but it also has a lot less information in it. Okay, so that's RAW versus JPEG. So a RAW file, it can look pretty ugly and unfinished to a non-professional, and it does need to be processed. A JPEG file is going to look better on the back of the camera or on your phone, but it offers fewer possibilities for modification later. So when I'm shooting with my pro cameras, I'm always shooting in RAW because I want as much possibility to make alterations later as I could possibly have. I also set up my phone camera to shoot in RAW plus JPEG. Some phones allow this and some don't, but I always shoot RAW plus JPEG so I can, if I don't like the way that the camera processed the JPEG, I will go in and process the RAW myself. So that's just the basis of how those two things work. Now we're going to get into the concept of dynamic range. And I promise all these things will come together and make sense in just a second. So we've got our RAW versus JPEG, and then we need to talk about the dynamic range of a camera. The dynamic range of a camera or an image is the difference between the brightest and the darkest areas in a scene and how much of that a camera can successfully capture. So detail in the highlights and detail in the shadows, okay? So you've got a really bright white over here and a really dark black over here. Can you capture detail in all of these areas? So the human eye is brilliant and evolved and beautiful, and it can capture about 20 stops of dynamic range, which is why when you're out at the park, you can see the brilliant blue sky, and you can also see the shadows under the tree and all the leaves laying there. You've got 20 full stops of beautiful, gorgeous, happy dynamic range to work with. The very best professional cameras offer about 14 to 15 stops of dynamic range, okay? And that's pretty good, but it's nothing like the human eye. And then your cell phone camera offers about 10 stops of dynamic range, right? That's about half of what the human eye can see. So let's talk about how that all works together. Let's look back at our hideous image right here. So we've got two factors at work. The human eye focal length, which we've already talked about, is about 50 millimeters versus the camera focal length, 27 millimeters. So while you were standing in this exact spot, your human eye was zoomed in on the purple tree and the blue sky behind it. The camera was zoomed out, and we got these bollards and the street and the asphalt and all this hideousness that you didn't even really realize was in the picture because that wasn't what you were focused on. And then also the human eye's dynamic range of 20 stops saw that beautiful blue sky and all the dark shadows in the bark and this tree. And the camera saw maybe 10 stops at most. So what happens is your camera phone starts making decisions for you. And sometimes those decisions are great. And sometimes, like in this case, those decisions are utterly wrong. So in this case, the camera phone decided, hey, you know, what's really important is some detail in these bollards down here. Like, we really want to see that texture. Also, I want to bring up, you know, the detail in these leaves over here on the far right. So I'm going to blow that sky out white, and we're not going to see any sky. And that's the opposite of what we would have chosen. Okay. And that's how this happens, is sometimes our cameras make decisions for us that are the wrong decisions. However, sometimes the processing algorithm is your friend, and I'm going to have some examples of that as well. So cameras are getting more and more sophisticated. About 2 months ago, I dropped my favorite Samsung cell phone and cracked the screen, and I had to buy a new camera for the first time in like 4 years, or a new phone for the first time in 4 years. And I picked up a Google Pixel, and I went on a road trip maybe a month later, and I was out taking some landscape photos. Now, like I said, I always take RAW versus JPEG. And so both of them show up in my camera roll. And imagine how shocked I was to see this. So on the left is the RAW photo. On the right is the photo that Google Pixel took. And it processed it, and it did a fantastic job. It looked at it and it said to itself, hey, This lady's trying to take a picture of a landscape, and I'll bet she wants the sky to be blue, and I bet she wants a lot of texture and shadow detail down here underneath these ferns. I'm going to give her all that. And it's brilliant. I mean, I have never had a cell phone camera that had this great of an algorithm for processing a landscape. I was quite frankly blown away. Unfortunately, it also does the same thing to selfies. And this is where you know my dedication to science, that I let this hideous photo of myself go on the internet. So on the left is a selfie that I took this morning with my beautiful favorite Samsung phone. And I'm really used to how that takes selfies of me. And I started taking selfies with the Google phone, and I'm like, what the heck? What happened? Like, why do I look so bad? This is not that I look bad. Actually, what's happening is Google is looking at me. I'm a pretty pale lady with pretty fair skin and, pink cheeks. And it looks at me and it's like, you know what? We don't think she's actually that pale. Let's darken up the skin. I think she's a little more tan than that. So they add in a little bit more tan. They add in a little bit more contrast. My skin here looks muddy and grayish. There's a lot of more yellow in it. So actually over here on the left with that Samsung is not only a much prettier photo, in my opinion, it's also more accurate to what my real skin tone is. And this photo here on the right is very yellow and very muddy and horrible to me. So again, they do a fantastic job on those landscapes. They do a miserable, miserable job in looking at the skin tones. Let's look at camera sharpening. Again, for landscapes, awesome. Raw file here on the left, you can see it's not very sharp. Over here on the right, Google sharpened it. They did a brilliant job. Everything that they would want me to sharpen, I would want them to sharpen, they sharpen. Look what they did to my skin though. That's not awesome. I don't love it, right? So here's my beautiful Samsung on the left. I mean, I'm in my 40s. I've got wrinkles in my skin. I know that. I've got texture in my skin. But over here, just the color tones plus the over sharpening, all this skin texture. Oh, it's just so miserable. So again, this camera is making decisions for me, and it does not necessarily reflect what I look like in real life, okay? So let's review all of the things that we've talked about why the camera screws up your photos and makes you look different than you actually do. So all phone cameras are relatively wide angle. Wide angle lenses distort faces and bodies. Phone camera software then processes your images. They can not only over sharpen them, they can change color tones, they can change the way your skin looks, they can change the contrast. So what you get is definitely not what you saw, okay? That camera is making decisions and might spit out any kind of a thing. So we're not only dealing with like the physical distortion of the face from the lenses, we're also dealing with the camera processing and what the camera is doing to you, all right? So again, so if we're on a decent selfie quest, what can we do? There are a few things that are within your control to get a decent selfie. And one of those is lighting. And I would say lighting is really one of the most important. So you need to find your lighting, which is going to be soft, filtered, non-directional light. So these photos I took within the same 30 seconds today. In one of them, I am facing straight towards a window that has a soft sheer in front of it. There's a beautiful, clean. It's filling in any lines and wrinkles. It's filling in any pores. It's not creating shadows. It's just a really beautiful, nice, fresh wash of light across the face. I turned 90 degrees to the side. And again, please respect my commitment to science for even putting this picture up here. But start to look at like the skin texture and the chin and this like line over here by my face and the line between my eyes. Like all of a sudden we have these harsh shadows that are causing lines where they weren't before. So light is important things about finding, about getting a good selfie. The other thing that you want to control for is camera angle, right? A slightly downward camera angle is going to suit most people. It's going to make the eyes look bigger and the face a little bit elongated. If for some reason you would want your face to look slimmer, it will do this at the expense of your nose looking bigger, but your face will look slimmer, okay? Those who want maybe a slightly stronger jaw, they might prefer like a slightly upward angle, right? So if you think your jaw is not as strong as you'd want it to be, stick that baby out towards the camera and it's going to look stronger and it's going to look like, a thicker jawline. So the camera angle has a big effect. Please don't go crazy with that like super top down camera angle. We know what you're doing. Don't do that. But the slightly down is really going to be good for most people. Really important too is get further away if you can. So use a tripod or take the photo as far away as possible and crop in. So these two photos, again, I took this morning. The photo on the left, I took from as far away as my arms would reach, and then I cropped it in. The photo on the right, I just took, that's not cropped at all. I just took it straight in. So again, look at the difference in the size of my face, the length of my face, the size of my nose, even the size of like the tip of my nose is larger. So even that distance of like 6-7 inches, the farther away you can get, the less distortion you're going to see in the face. So if that is something that bothers you, try to get as far away as you can. In group shots, if you're taking a group shot or you're going to be in a group shot, try to make sure that everybody is at an equal distance to the camera. Don't have some people really close up and some people really far away. If you can't make sure about that, don't be the person in the group that's closest to the camera. Be the person in the group that's farthest from the camera. I got a big old head. So if I've got like 3 people next to me and I'm the closest to the camera with my big head, it's just I'm gonna look like the Gandalf to everybody else's Frodo. So if you can't get everybody at an equal distance, just strategically position yourself so that you're not the closest to the camera. Don't stick any part of you towards the camera that you don't want to appear larger. So if you don't want your butt larger, don't stick it out there. If you don't want your chin larger, don't stick it out there. If you think your forehead is too big, don't angle your forehead towards the camera. Try to think about those angles. And it's fine to like practice and hold your phone and figure out what your angle is and what really works for you. So that is really quick overview of why selfies are completely inaccurate. No, you don't really look like that. I think the most important thing for me with any of this is to, again, release anybody who's watching this from that tyranny of the image. I've had so many people write into me and say, this blog made me feel better. I was in tears seeing these photos. I was so miserable. And I think as humans, the kind of like, if we're self-critical humans, we have this thing that if we see a really terrible picture of ourselves, we think that worst picture of me that I've ever seen is the actual truth. Every other decent photo I've ever seen is a lie, and that horrible picture is the absolute truth. And I'm here to tell you that every photo is slightly a lie, and the ugly photo of you is the biggest lie of all. So throw those ugly photos away. I know it is really difficult to not be overwhelmed by what you look like in a photo and let it impact you. But I just hope that this information helps you process that in a different way. And I have now gotten to the point, this is really a struggle for me too, but I've really gotten to the point where I can look at like 35 terrible photos of me and be like, no, garbage, 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 throw away. Oh, nice angle, keeping it.